of discussion on the topic, because I'm not, like, this is not my PhD thesis, this is the same thing I'm doing. So I'm going to talk about public announcement and intuitionistic epistemic logic today. So, I mean, in general, one can see different reasons for studying that. First would be like just a purely technical reason. You can think that, well, it's just interesting, what happens then? Another reason would be, okay, we actually are interested in agents, and we're interested in their epistemic abilities, for example, like how their beliefs work, how their dexastic, like their beliefs and knowledge works, and what are their goals. For example, in VDI logics, they discuss that, and we also can say, okay, but there are also always some deductive presumptions in the sense what basic logic does an agent use. And so, in this case, we can see epistemic, intuitionistic epistemic logic and its dynamic as a sort of combining epistemic capabilities, epistemic characteristics of an agent with the deductive ones. So, some sort of, this is not quite a motivation, but in general, there are already problems when one talks about intuitionistic modal logic in general, because one can understand various systems and their so in the literature, different systems are called intuitionistic modal logic, and then have even for K there can be different sets of axioms. The same thing, of course, happens when we talk about a more particular one, when we interpret boxes of knowledge, and there are several systems already existing. And so the question I would like to ask, so how to model the knowledge accumulation in the intuitionistic setting. And I'm taking a very particular approach, a very particular already existing intuitionistic epistemic logic, the system IEL, which stands for Intuitionistic Epistemic Logic, proposed by Artyomov and his PhD students at high school, I think around 5 or 7 years ago. And it has a very particular understanding of knowledge and belief in that system that I'm going to talk about. And I would call this, this is in a sense a very non-standard if we compare it to the classical epistemic logic. So, yes, first of all, to say a few words about the intuitionistic epistemic logic. Well, it's based on intuitionistic propositional logic, obviously, so where the double negation elimination fails, the criminal data fails, or the principle of exclude middle. So, so as I already said, the logic I'm considering was proposed by Tudor Popescu and Sergei Artyomov. And there are two systems actually that they discuss. So it's a part of the PhD thesis of Popescu, and also they have an article, several articles on that. And they consider two systems, one for intuitionistic epistemic logic, and another one would be what they call intuitionistic belief. So, although in principle, to the workshop might have been better to talk about belief, but I'm going to talk more about knowledge because it's simpler a little bit. And the problems that already arise when we talk about knowledge. So, yes, it is based on so-called Brouwer-Hating-Kolmogorov interpretation. So, where we interpret truth of a formula, like it's as having a proof. So, this is a very standard, non-formal semantics for intuitionistic logic. And in that setting, how would one understand knowledge? So, they suggest to say that, okay, because the concept of just truth is already very strong, because it yields having a proof, then knowledge would be something less strong. And it says so that knowledge of a formula can be interpreted as it is verified that the formula holds intuitionistically. So that there is a proof, but the proof might not be necessarily specified in the process of verification. And I'll give several examples. And I know that these, some especially people working in epistemology, within epistemology, they consider it a little bit problematic, but I personally like the definition of knowledge. So yes, and here goes the VHK semantics for just intuitions, it's intuitionistic epistemic logic without any updates yet. So, and this is quite standard, but still let's go through it. So we say that a proof of conjunction consists of a proof of conjuncts. Separate proofs, proof of disjunction consists of either having a proof of one disjunct or having a proof of another disjunct, which is important for intuitionistic logic. So a proof of implication consists in a construction which gives a proof of B given the proof of A, while negation is just an abbreviation from formula to falsum. And a proof of the proof of knowledge, the proof of an agent knows A, is a conclusive evidence of verification that A has a proof. This is, I think, what can cause questions in the sense like what would be actually a verification. And so to give some possible examples, we can have a look at several so-called maybe even real-world scenario that they suggest. Some of them I find more convincing, some less. So the zero-knowledge protocol, right? When the proof gives us an answer that a statement in question is true without providing the proof. And it seems very abstract, but we can actually take an example with, we give a proof to Isabel checks and says yes. Well, in that case, we already have proof. Or we give a proof to proof assistant, and the proof assistant, well, normally it also gives us a proof, but we can imagine a situation where we can just get an answer yes or no, but we trust, so we trust the source and we have the procedure to verify that the source is correct. But we don't have the proof per se, so we'll just get an answer yes or no. Testimony or authority is something that I think everyone can imagine. So we, even in gaining knowledge, for example, mathematical knowledge, one can say, all right, I know some theorem, but I cannot reproduce the proof right now. Does it mean that I don't know it? No, I know it. I might even once saw the proof, might have seen the proof, but at this moment, I cannot provide it. But I can use it in a meaningful sense in my research, and so that can also be some sort of an example of the of such verification. Yes. Also, a nice example is so-called existential quantification, so that I have all the evidence to believe that something exists, but I don't have, but I cannot give the instance. And for proof to be constructive, we need an instance in that case. So those are kind of examples where such a notion of knowledge would be actually meaningful. And because of that, we get quite surprising axioms. Of course, the chaos axiom is not surprising, I would say, but for example, we don't have the so-called reflection principle, which is normal. We get a co-reflection principle, because if we have a proof of a formula, then we know the formula. So then we can also have a verification-based knowledge of a formula. Whereas if we have verification-based knowledge of a formula, that doesn't mean that we have a proof. That's something I've talked already about. And but however, so if we want to have knowledge rather than belief, we should still ensure that the statement actually is true. And here, where this intuitionistic reflection becomes helpful, So we cannot say from KA follows A, but we can definitely say that from KA follows not A. And which would correspond to the classical truth. And of course, if we get rid of the axiom form, the intuitionistic reflection, then we would get what they call IPAL minus, which actually is then the doxastic system, the system of intuitionistic belief. Yeah. So, and well, there are several semantics, of course, not only Kriple semantics, but for me, Kriple semantics is easier to operate with, rather than there is also a neighborhood semantics for that system. And Kriple semantics is standard Kriple semantics with two relations. One relation is standard for intuitionistic logic. So, yeah, it's a partial modal, so reflexive, transitive, and antisymmetric. We can lift antisymmetricity, it's not that important. But yes, and we also have another knowledge relation, which is and the conditions, so that it is related to the intuitionistic relation, of course. Yes, and the truth conditions. Well, the semantics allows us to have ordinary truth conditions or ordinary truth conditions for the system. So KA, if is true in all the worlds accessible from the current world. So, and maybe that would be the time to come to a public announcement. Well, first of all, what would be problematic with the public announcement? We need to choose what we actually want, because now we have sort of two different types of truth in a sense. We have the intuitionistic truth, and we can encode the classical truth via double negation. So when we say public announcement, what sort of truth should it? What sort of update? Is it just are we given a proof? And then it's simpler, and that's what I consider. Or are we just giving a verification? That would influence mostly the knowledge system. So those two ways of going are. So those two, there are two possible ways of doing. So I decided to first have a look at what would happen if I'm given a proof. And of course, we still can have both the box and the diamond one. And I'm providing it here, but one should say that actually the diamond is really redundant in a sense, so this is not an interesting system. But so, just to remind you of the public announcement operator, so the box operator reads as after every public announcement of phi, it holds a psi. What does it mean? It means that the public announcement can be like so that it's not necessarily a truthful. It doesn't necessarily hold. And then after some truthful public announcement of yeah, correct, of psi holds, this would be the diamond operator. And the truth conditions, of course, should be slightly altered. If we compare them to the conditions of ordinary one, because in Kriple semantics we can, for intuitionistic logic, we can have worlds where neither, let's say, phi nor not phi is true. So we should account for that. And in this semantics, I just suggest in the modified model to cross out the worlds whether not phi holds. No, wait, where phi doesn't. Sorry, to get rid of the worlds where phi doesn't hold. So yes, and so there is a quite simple Hilbert-style axiomatization. Of course, in this case, we should consider disjunction separately because we cannot. Yes, we are in the intuitionistic case. But the proof of completeness is done by a classical technique for public announcement for classical logic. We can still reduce it to the language without the public announcement operator. Yes, and there's also a corresponding one with a diamond, but so why am I saying that actually that the diamond is not very meaningful? Well, because it requires, by this condition, so it requires phi to be true, and in the side, it's like it doesn't do actually, if we are already in the world where phi is true, so we already see only the worlds where the phi is true. And yes, of course, we delete the worlds, but they are behind us. So in a sense, it's like, technically it does something, but not in a very meaningful way. Yes. So, I would say, in the conclusion, so what has in general already been done. So, I looked into different ways of investigating how to extend so far intuitionistic epistemic logic, so proven completeness for adequacy, so for the strong updates, as I called it, so where we're giving the proof. As I have said, just to recap, that knowledge in such systems is a weaker knowledge, notion than the notion of proof, and hence weaker than ordinary intuitionistic truth. So yeah, we can still add two public announcement operators. Yes, one modal is the announcement that have already been proved. Yes. Yeah, and another one allows us to reason about announcements in the world where the announced formula is not true yet. Yes, there's a Hilbert-style standardization of Kriple semantics with soundness and completeness. And already the system becomes more complicated than in the classical, of course, than in a classical scenario. What further to do? So first of all, to have another type of announcement, which is more interesting in a sense, because there's this whole discussion about verification. So here's a good example. Okay, now I'm given a verification. What happens? Another, to have a look at the system of belief and possible updates in the system of belief. Well, of course, one can always ask, okay, there we've had only one agent, we can always make it multi-agent. That doesn't seem to be problematic. What would be with common knowledge in such a setting, if we have many agents and other types of information updates? Another thing I would like to consider for the system is the possibility of giving game semantics, because there is a good candidate for the probability game for that system. Yes, and there are some references, and yeah, I think if you have any questions, I'll be happy to